Tianbao Fu Yao Lu. Chapter 131. Sigils of the Void. Where's Xiaoyu? What exactly happened here? Get into the tower. Li Jinglong and Ashinakayan swiftly dodged the roaring dragons that came charging at them from above. Every one of them was at least about Xiaoyu's size, and they roared wildly as they spewed out blazing flames and chilly ice towards the ground, which followed after the two people as they fled. In midair, some of the jiao slammed into each other from time to time, and then they began to bite and tear at each other. Large spurts of pungent jiao blood came splashing downwards. Li Jinglong was unflustered in the face of chaos, and with a hasty glance, he glimpsed the only safe region in this place, this tower within the tower that rose loftily into the clouds, surrounded on all sides by thorns. The jiao flew back and forth, lightning flashed, but none of the jiao flames could approach the tower within the tower. Li Jinglong charged forward, while Ashinakayan followed behind. As the two of them dashed towards the tower, the jiao behind Ashinakayan had already caught up. With a swift turn, Li Jinglong passed his sword to his left hand, while he gathered up the light of the heart lamp in his right, suddenly shooting out a huge meteor. In an instant, the meteor exploded outwards, rising into the sky. There was only a single flash, but the moment the blazing light burst into existence, the jiao horde scattered into the air to escape it. A beam of jiao flame went awry and brushed past Ashinakayan as it shot into the distance. Ashinakayan, in response, rolled across the ground, sliding past Li Jinglong. Li Jinglong immediately grabbed his arm, swiftly charging towards the stairs of the tower within the tower, and the two of them sped up to the door of the tower. "Where's the entrance?" Ashinakayan shouted. "Hurry up and open the door." Li Jinglong banged at the tall tower behind him. Even more jiao now noticed Li Jinglong's deliberate provocation, and they began to sink towards the bottom of the tower, roaring as they turned their gazes on them. "Open the door!" Ashinakayan roared. "There's no door!" Li Jinglong shouted back. Ashinakayan found that on one wall of the tower, there was a faintly glowing symbol. It was almost exactly the same as the symbol guarding the door of the exorcism department. "Isn't this the one on the outside of the exorcism department's door? Open it on your own." Li Jinglong raised the sword of wisdom, and the body of the blade glowed with white light, driving away the jiao that came charging towards them. As another jiao, flashing with blue light, charged downwards, the door of the tower behind them finally vanished with a wang. Li Jinglong and Ashinakayan both couldn't help toppling backwards, and they fell inside. Right after that, the doors of the tower closed again, and the symbol appeared on the door before being absorbed. With a wang, it began to glow, repelling the jiao that were charging at the door back. The jiao horde's attack was fruitless, so they once again rose into the air, flying towards the top of the tower. Their surroundings were so silent that a pin falling to the floor could be heard. Li Jinglong raised his sword, which glowed with light, illuminating a small area around them. Thankfully, they hadn't run into yet another dimension within the tower. The tower was simply a tower. The floor of the lowest layer was very vast, and it was paved with stone cobbles. In the middle appeared another sigil, as if there was another exit to the tower. To one side were stairs leading up the tower, and the two of them looked up. Ashinakayan said, "The array on the ground here should lead to the 8th level of the dragon subduing tower." Ashinakayan studied the sigils in the middle of the tower, before saying, "It's really strange. Why are the arrays here so similar to the ones we have at home?" That array had evidently been here for a long time, and it had much to do with all of Sumeru can be contained within a mustard seed. Through just a bit of thought, Li Jinglong grasped vaguely at a clue. The dragon subduing tower was built by an unknown person. Back in the day, it had imprisoned Xiaoyu and a group of fierce jiao, and since Xiaoyu had resided in this tower for a long time, it naturally knew of these symbols. After it had escaped the tower, Xiaoyu used this teleportation array and taught it to the nine-tailed heavenly fox, who then used it to open up a pocket dimension and create the blood pool. Chu Yangxi would probably have understood the way these sigils of the void worked in the first place, and after defeating the nine-tailed heavenly fox, had pretended to just copy the sigils and had separated the exorcism department into a pocket dimension as well. But back then, Ashinakayan hadn't come yet, so naturally he didn't know this inside information. Li Jinglong explained that briefly to him. Ashinakayan then went to the foot of the staircase and looked up again. I got it. Should we go down or up? Something seemed to be glowing up top, and after pondering for a brief moment, Li Jinglong said, since we've already come inside, our time has probably synchronized with the time in the tower. Let's go up the tower first to take a look. Ashinakayan replied, I'm just worried that they'll be waiting for too long outside. Let's check the time, Li Jinglong ordered. Before they entered the tower, Chu had given them a celestial bodies disc. Though it was named celestial bodies, its internal workings actually slowly rotated along based on a spring mechanism, and every 12 shishan, it would need to be rewound so that the inner and outer dials would continue to spin. A master craftsman had made this apparatus, and one revolution of the inner dial represented 1 day, while one revolution of the outer dial represented 1 year. That was an artifact that had been made when past generations of dragon-subduing saints had entered and exited the tower. But now, since time in the tower passed differently inside and out, it could only be used to keep time. Ashinakayan pulled out the disc and glanced at it, before saying, 1K has already passed. Li Jinglong figured that they had to move quickly, so he began to climb up the stairs. The second layer of this tower was actually an expansive room, in which had been placed quite a few wooden horses and wooden people, as well as dudu, bedding, and other similar items for infants to use. A musty, damp smell pervaded the room, as if the owner of this place had been gone for less than a month. Aside from the child-sized bed, there was also a woman's vanity placed in the corner, on which was placed rouge and powder, as well as a wooden comb. Li Jinglong glanced at it, and upon seeing that the powder had yet to dry, said, this must have been where Yangxi lived when he was young. Let's keep heading up. The third layer and up were respectively a dining room, guest bedrooms, and so on, and it seemed like back when Yeji had been around, she had stayed here for quite some time. She had seemingly only left the tower after Yangxi was 100 days old. Ashinakayan didn't know any of this information, but he didn't ask any extra questions either. The further up he went, the brighter the light became. You have returned. When they set foot on the 9th story, the silhouette of a man facing a glowing ball of light, murmured, there are less than 40 days left. That man had dragon horns sprouting out of his forehead, and his robes billowed in the wind. He looked exactly like the Kun god had when he had taken spiritual form. The only difference was that his entire body was glowing, as if he was setting himself alight. In front of him was a Taiji ball, with yin and yang in perfect opposition, and it was slowly spinning under the influence of his magic. This was the top of the tower, and it was open to the air, leaving only 9 pillars holding up the very top of the tower. Rings of powdered light scattered off the Taiji ball, spreading outwards one by one, and less than 5 jang from them was an enormous horde of Qiao. They were circling around the top of the tower, roaring and spewing out electricity as they continually assaulted this tall tower, waiting for the array that bound them here to collapse. Li Jinglong walked over to stand across from that man, and he bowed slightly. I cannot see, the man said. You are not Yangxi. Who are you? Lord Yeming. Li Jinglong asked, drawing in a deep breath. The thunder and lighting around them was growing stronger and stronger, and the Taiji ball trembled again and again, as if it was starting to grow unstable under the continued assault of the Qiao. Li Jinglong pressed one hand to his sword and pulled it out slightly. The light of the heart lamp glimmered forth from the sword of wisdom, and with a huge boom, the Jiao's frenzied attacks were beaten back for a time as they each slowly retreated a bit. Akalanatha, that man asked. Why is it you? When Li Jinglong heard those words, he suddenly turned his head. Upon the Jiao horde retreating, the pressure on the Taiji ball lessened temporarily. The man called forth a wave of magic that blossomed into a wave of light, which wrapped around Li Jinglong's body. Li Jinglong was once again speechless, but that man said, "I understand it all now." Li Jinglong said, "You are Yeming," the man replied. "The void that stretches above and below is space, and the eternity that stretches from the past to the present is time. You may also call me the Dragon of Time. I originally thought that the one who had returned was Yangtze. I had not expected that it would be the successor of Akalanatha. Thank you for coming to repair the mistake that I have made." "Where is Xiaoyu?" Li Jinglong asked. "It has escaped again," Yeming replied. "While you were entering the tower, it borrowed the passageway the array created and had not yet closed. As soon as it returned once more, it already predicted that you would send a second group of people in." Li Jinglong. Losing a second time made Li Jinglong strongly wish to slap himself twice. He had really underestimated his enemy too much. "Tell me how this all came about," Li Jinglong said, "otherwise I may not know where to start." "This is a very long story," Yeming replied calmly. "Even if the very last bit of my dragon soul were to vanish, it will be no harm to tell you. On the second level, the snowstorm quieted temporarily, and the world grew impossibly quiet. Qiu Yangxi and Hung Jun were leaned up against that rock that had the phoenix plume placed on it, and they were both nodding off. Suddenly, Hung Jun woke up, and Qiu Yangxi woke as well. "Did you have a dream?" Qiu Yangxi asked. Hung Jun shook his head. "Qiu Yangxi, there was a period of time where you constantly had bad dreams." "How did you know?" "I heard it in the middle of the night." "Has it gotten better after Lu Su checked you over?" Hung Jun ed. In reality, after he and Li Jinglong had gotten together, it had been a long time since he had had dreams. The heart lamp suppressed the power of the nightmares in him and made him feel incomparably safe. Right now, he could already sense, in a very far away place, Li Jinglong was putting forth the magic of the heart lamp. He had entered the tower to save Hung Jun. "Actually, I'm hungry," Hung Jun said. "I'll find something for you to eat after this," Qiu Yangxi said. "I haven't been down this far either." "What are we going to do now?" "We're going to find the dragon on this layer and ask it to send us up," Qiu Yangxi explained. "Aside from the bottom of the tower, there is at least one dragon king on every level that stands guard over the Qiao, thus upholding the barrier here." Hung Jun recalled that Qiu Yangxi had mentioned before, aside from the Qiao, there were also dragons that had violated the laws of the heavens before and were locked up in the tower. He couldn't resist asking, what wrongs did they commit? "Killing people," Qiu Yangxi said, straightening his armor. "Let's go, we've got to make good use of our time." Hung Jun yawned, before rising and following behind Qiu Yangxi. He asked, "Then what about Yeming?" It hasn't committed any crimes," Qiu Yangxi said. "It is simply upholding its promise to imprison the Qiao, to prevent them from wreaking havoc wantonly across the divine land." Hung Jun then asked, "Who built this tower?" "I don't know," Qiu Yangxi replied. "In my memories, I've only seen Yeming a few times. When I was young, I didn't understand what was going on, and after I grew up, every time I came in was to ask for advice. I rarely had the chance to ask questions to my heart's content." Hung Jun then asked, "So we simply need to bring the ashes up, right?" Qiu Yangxi explained, "While its Hunpo are still here, we'll take the opportunity to let its ashes meld into its dragon soul, then twist time back. Thankfully we didn't fall into the deepest level." "What is the deepest level?" Hung Jun asked curiously. "It's an abyss," Qiu Yangxi said. "There is no light there, nor is there any passage of time. In reality, the Jiao should have gone to the very bottom layer, because as soon as they fall in, they will no longer be able to leave." The two of them passed through the forest, only to see a huge cemetery. The snowstorm started up again, and it lashed at their faces. The wild wind sounded like the repeated roars of a dragon. Who is disturbing this lord's rest? Didn't you wake up a long time ago? Hung Jun said, looking up. We started hearing your shouts a while ago. Chu Yangxi hurriedly shushed him. Shh, shh. Descendant of the avian tribe, how dare you speak such impertinent words? Get out of the tower. And with that, a mouthful of icy dragon breath came flooding towards them. Chu Yangxi hurriedly called, Dragon King. Please do not be angry. When Hung Jun saw the storm coming towards him, he immediately called up the pentacolor sacred light, and the phoenix feather seemed to sense the danger as well, because it immediately glowed with the red of flames, sending out a guarding ring of flame that hovered around Hung Jun. Chu Yangxi had no attention to spare for begging for mercy, and the landscape brush twirled between his fingers, sweeping in a vast stroke across the world. In that instant, Hung Jun, Chu Yangxi, and that dragon roaring amidst the snowstorm were all dragged into an ink landscape painting. It was the second time that Hung Jun had been brought into a painting, after the Deer King Jaitaka in Dunhuang. That sensation was truly an odd one, because the snowstorm that had been sweeping towards him from the left and the right was suddenly overhead, yet it had also grown much more simplified. He raised his pentacolor sacred light, which clashed with the snowstorm. Meanwhile, Chu Yangxi waved his brush again, shouting, Open! The painting immediately dissipated, and the two of them returned once more to the real world, only to see that a huge, blue dragon king had appeared in the middle of the cemetery. It had its head lifted to the sky as it roared, making the whole world quake as it did so. Hung Jun discovered that two balls of black flames had actually appeared in that dragon soul's eyes. Chu Yangxi was greatly shocked, and he shouted, Dragon King! The Dragon King once again came charging towards them. Hung Jun flicked the pentacolor sacred light, raising a wall of snow almost a jong in height, blocking the ice dragon's breath. The wall of snow immediately crystallized into ice, and Chu Yangxi glanced around. Hung Jun shouted, It's been corrupted. Hurry up and think of a method. Chu Yangxi called back, Look at its reverse scale. In the middle of all that he was doing, Hung Jun turned and glanced, only to see that the area under the dragon's throat where its reverse scale originally had been was now filled with black chi instead, as if an odd, monstrous parasite had latched onto it. Chu Yangxi shouted, Can you fly? The Dragon King came charging towards the two of them, so Hung Jun and Chu Yangxi dashed to the two sides to escape. The ground of the cemetery was sent flying into the air as the dragon writhed, and Hung Jun shouted, I don't know how to fly. I'll send you up. Chu Yangxi shouted. Hung Jun, watch out. The dragon slammed into Chu Yangxi, and Hung Jun let out an anxious shout. Chu Yangxi, however, did not dodge nor retreat. Instead, with a wave of his brush, the two of them once again entered a painting, and Chu Yangxi shouted, Rise! He then spread his arms, his entire body floating into the air, and the splash ink mountains spun around them. Hung Jun immediately felt his entire body being turned around as they began to plummet rapidly towards the edge of the painting. Open! With another loud shout, the surface of the painting dissipated, and Hung Jun felt himself once again leave the painting. Right before this, when the sky and the earth had been turning around him, he was already in the air, and in this instant, with no loss of momentum, he plummeted upwards to the highest point, before beginning to fall down towards the ground below. Chu Yangxi and that Dragon King were embroiled in a battle as they flew into the air. Hung Jun put the throwing knives together, transforming them into the glaive. He borrowed the momentum of his fall as he shot forward, swiftly flying past the Dragon King's neck. A good chance. Chu Yangxi shouted. The Dragon King had already turned its head, and its icy, blazing breath went sweeping towards Chu Yangxi. Chu Yangxi was actually using himself as bait, ignoring his own safety. And at that very last moment, Hung Jun swept by its neck, stabbing down at its heart. That swing was very vigorous, and instantly, a monster, its fangs and claws bared, was hacked off. The icy breath that the Dragon King was spewing immediately stopped, and its eyes lost the light in them as it suddenly collapsed to one side. That black monster, after leaving the Dragon King's body, began to charge towards Hung Jun. Qiu Yangxi stepped on the head of the fallen Dragon King as he also rushed towards Hung Jun, and in midair, he grabbed him and turned, waved his brush, and shouted, "Capture!" With a weng, the painting unfurled, and in the instant that the monster pounced, Qiu Yangxi drew a firm circle around it, sending it into the painting scroll. Wah! Qiu Yangxi and Hung Jun plummeted downwards, landing, thud thud, into the snow below. Hung Jun spat out a mouthful of snow, coughing as he did so. Qiu Yangxi struggled to his feet, before racing towards the Dragon King slumped on the ground. Dragon King! Qiu Yangxi rushed to that dragon's side, and Hung Jun followed after him, studying that dragon curiously. This was the first time that Hung Jun was seeing a real live dragon. He had often heard Chongming say that the phoenix and the dragon tribes were enemies that could not abide to live under the same sky, and many years ago, the dragons and the phoenixes had even fought an earth-shaking battle. But when Hung Jun thought about it that way, it would only make sense if the dragon was not as powerful as Chongming, who was a phoenix. It had only spewed a few breaths before it collapsed. 200 years ago, Chongming had actually been grievously injured by Xiaoyu. Technically speaking, Xiaoyu was only a Qiao, and this Dragon King's attack power was evidently higher than Xiaoyu's. What was going on here? End chapter. Tianbao Fu Yao Lu. Chapter 132. Xiaoyu's villain origin story. Dragon subduing saint. That Dragon King braced itself before turning on its side. Blood kept gushing forth from the place where its heart was. Who are you? Qiu Yangxi asked. Young dragon subduing saint, the Dragon King said, I have heard of you. You are? Yaji scowled. Qiu Yangxi, what? My mom was called Li Shunying, not Yaji. Amo died, and Yaji gave birth to you, the Dragon King said. On the 9th layer, Yeming granted you a single dragon's breath. Do you not know each other? Hung Jun asked. Qiu Yangxi shook his head, his expression one of confusion. I have never gone below the 7th layer. Dragon King, what should I address you as? It's been too long, that Dragon King replied solemnly. I can no longer recall my name clearly. Hung Jun hurriedly pointed into the distance, reminding Qiu Yangxi that they had to hurry upwards. With that, Qiu Yangxi explained what had happened to the Dragon King, and about halfway through, the Dragon King asked, Yeming's bones have already been retrieved. Qiu Yangxi pulled out the bottle. That Dragon King said, then I will send you up right away. Can you fly? Hung Jun studied this dragon's wound, only to realize that the place where its heart was looked as if it had been dug open, and it was a mess of fresh blood. When Xiaoyu escaped from the abyss, it infected me with devil qi, that Dragon King said. It is no issue. I was already very, very old to begin with. Now I feel much more comfortable. Climb on. Hung Jun said, let me dress the wound for you first. Though he called it dressing the wound, Hung Jun didn't have much medicine on hand. Even if he did, he wouldn't have known how to cure a dragon, but he kept feeling as if this old dragon's wound was grave indeed. Use my cloak, Qiu Yangxi offered. Hung Jun retrieved the cloak, before reaching out with his fingers to peel apart the Dragon King's wound to investigate what the situation was inside. A dragon's heart, a human's heart, and an animal's heart were all very different. This heart had 12 chambers, but many of them had already rotted away and were giving off a nasty stink. Hung Jun didn't dare to apply too much pressure, afraid that if he did, he would cause its heart to burst and all of the blood in its body would gush out. Dragon blood was lethally poisonous, but since Hung Jun had the pentacolor sacred light protecting him, he wasn't afraid. He first retrieved the needle and thread he used for sutures, sewing up that split heart. Time in the tower does not flow the same as time outside, the Dragon King said, lying there stiffly, allowing Hung Jun to get to work. Do not waste time on me. It's no issue, Hung Jun said. I've got to heal you first. Chu Yangxi watched quietly from the side. Before this, Hung Jun had been afraid that if he dallied for too long in the tower, he and Li Jinglong would be forever separated, but as long as Li Jinglong had also come inside, their time would pass at the same rate, and they would naturally be able to run into each other, so he was no longer very worried. The Dragon King quietly allowed Hung Jun to work, and from time to time, its huge, cartwheel-sized eyes would rotate. Chu Yangxi asked, back then, how did Xiaoyu escape? The Dragon King replied, it was not originally at the bottom of the tower. Only after it attempted to escape the first time was it sent down into the lowest layer. Dragon subduing saint, I imagine that you must know what crimes the Jiao imprisoned in the deepest layer have committed. Rebelling against the Dragon Kings, or trying to escape, Chu Yangxi said. Exactly, the Dragon King replied. For all of the Jiao in the tower, generally speaking, the day will come when their sentence comes to an end, and they will leave the tower. Only those who attack the barrier and purposefully try to escape, only to fail, are imprisoned in the deepest layer. Hung Jun's hands were covered in dragon blood as he asked, how many years was Xiaoyu supposed to be imprisoned for originally? That is a question for Yeming, the Dragon King said slowly. Xiaoyu is the only Jiao to have been born within the tower. Hung Jun had finished sewing up the Dragon King's heart, and he was now listening to Chu Yangxi and the Dragon King's conversation. He learned that the dragon subduing tower and the mortal world were two different worlds, and there were two more worlds contained within the tower itself. One world consisted of the second to the ninth layer, the prison which contained the Jiao. And the bottom of the tower, the first layer, was another world. In that world, time basically did not move at all, and the Jiao that were cast into the abyss were basically the same as death row prisoners. What they faced was eternal darkness and loneliness. Technically speaking, there's so many Jiao imprisoned here, so why was Xiaoyu the only one born here? Hung Jun found the medicine to invigorate the blood and induce the growth of flesh that he carried with him, and he carefully scattered some on the heart that he had finished sewing up. He hesitated for a moment, before pulling out the pills that Chongming had given him. He crushed them to powder and mixed it, before evenly spreading it over the heart. Jiao are unable to produce offspring, Chu Yangxi said, because they did not undergo a tribulation of lightning, nor has anyone properly named them. Named. Hung Jun seemed to recall that Chongming had mentioned this term before as well, but he had forgotten when. To understand Xiaoyu's life, you must first understand what a Jiao is, Chu Yangxi said. He and Hung Jun worked together to bandage the Dragon King's neck, and Hung Jun hopped onto its back and tied the cloak, finishing up with some difficulty. The Dragon King's neck was still weeping blood, but it said, I feel much better now. Let me bring you two up. Chu Yangxi and Hung Jun climbed onto the dragon's head, and the Dragon King slowly rose into the air, flying into the sky. What is a Jiao? Hung Jun asked. A Jiao is formed from the spirit of a dragon, the Dragon King replied. They are vipers, crawling bugs, snakes, fish, all members of the aquatic tribe born from the power of dragons, who wish for nothing more in their lives than to become a dragon. The power of dragons give rise to Jiao, Chu Yangxi explained to Hung Jun. But Jiao are unable to birth more Jiao. Only after cultivating into dragons can they have offspring. After Chu Yangxi explained, Hung Jun understood, there was no way for Jiao to breed amongst themselves and produce viable offspring. Legend had it that the dragon had 9 sons, and each was different in his own way, but that was simply because a dragon's nature was to be licentious. When the dragon bred with the turtle, that created the bixi, when it bred with the huge fish, that gave rise to the chaiwen. Dragons and Jiao were not the same, even though they both counted amongst the dragon tribe. In the world, dragons and phoenixes were treated with great respect, dragons were an immeasurably lofty, elevated existence, and their numbers were also very few. The origins of Jiao had nothing to do with dragons and their breeding, but rather with how the dragons died. They either sank into the rivers and lakes, or they fell silent amidst the lands and seas. As the dragons died out, the powerful spirits they possessed while they were alive did not die off, instead slowly seeping into the forests and the lakes. The members of the aquatic tribes could feed on portions of this spirit and take on a new form, shedding their outer skins like dragons as they turned into long, snake-like young Jiao. As soon as they passed over that threshold, they were able to gain large amounts of power so that they could work hard to achieve their most vaunted goal in cultivation, turning into dragons themselves. But this power came with a price. After they turned into Jiao, they were no longer able to breed with either their own kind or with other kinds to produce offspring, because the bodies of the Jiao tribe were in and of themselves imperfect. During the Age of Legends, the dragon tribe had once been the rulers of the world, but after the dragons clashed with both the Yao and the ancient immortals in several large battles, a large number of dragons had died. The Jiao had also started to emerge in large numbers and began to make waves across the divine land. In the end, one ancient immortal struck a deal with the dragon tribe and built the dragon-subduing tower, before imprisoning the Jiao horde inside. 7 great dragon kings also agreed to this deal, and they entered the tower willingly to shoulder the burden of guarding the prisoners. When did this happen? Hung Jun asked. It has been very long since then, that dragon king muttered as it flew towards the light pillar in the distance. In your human realm, it would have been when you the Great controlled the waters. Hung Jun hadn't thought that it would have been so long ago, that was way back in the Middle Ages. I have heard that their sentences were due to last for a millennia, Qiu Yangxi said. 1 day in the tower is 1 year in the outside world, the Dragon King said in reply. The reason the ancient immortal did this was because they were hoping that as time went on, the mortals could cultivate their skills to higher and higher levels, and when the Jiao's sentences came to an end, the mortals would no longer be afraid of suffering at the hands of the Jiao in the tower. Hung Jun's calculations were already completely muddled. 1,000 years in the tower meant the passage of some tens of thousands of years in the human realm. When he thought about it like that, these were truly very long-distant events, and when that time came, who knows what the humans would have become in that time. Then how was Xiaoyu born? Hung Jun asked. Xiaoyu's birth was an accident, the Dragon King said, lost in its thoughts. Technically, it hadn't been very long since the Jiao horde had been locked away in the tower, according to the reckoning of time within the tower. After all, from the era of Yu the Great until now, only a few thousand years had passed, so within the dragon-subduing tower, that would have been no more than a decade or two. After the dragon-subduing tower was built, Yeming took control at the highest level, and he stood guard at the 9th level. This ancient dragon god who had been born as soon as the heavens and the earth had first split was in possession of the power to control time. However, the only thing that inflicted frustration on it was that very same time. Under its control, all living beings' perception of time changed. The only being that was unaffected by the passage of time was itself, that was to say, the passage of time inside and outside the tower was equal to it. Ever since the tower had been built, Yeming had lived alone on the 9th level. His time remained frozen, which meant that he had lived out the equivalent of thousands of years. Then he must have been so lonely, Hung Jun said. For some reason, he was reminded of Chongming, living in Yejin Palace alone. The Dragon King agreed. Too many troubles in the world have come from being too bored. Being bored easily gives rise to troubles. Qiu Yangxi. As time went on, Yeming would leave the 9th level from time to time. He would go all the way down to the 2nd level, before slowly walking back up. He measured every kun of the ground, counted all of the stairs on the mountains, in the graveyards, to the monuments, in the palaces. It figured out how many stairs there were, how many trees, how many rocks. As it was preparing to count the grains of sand, it made the acquaintance of a Jiao in the forest on the 5th level. Was that Xia Yu's mother? Chu Yangxi asked. Do you really not know anything at all? The corners of Hung Jun's mouth twitched. Chu Yangxi said in reply, Yeming has never told me any of this. The Jiao and the dragons are all male, the Dragon King said. There are no female dragons or female Jiao. Hung Jun asked, why's that? We were born from the power of Yang, the Dragon King said. We are not like humans, who are made from a mix of yin and yang. Take Shen for example, which are formed from the gathering of yin energy. Shen can only be female. Yeming seemed to have been alone for too long, and he too needed companionship, so that Jiao had taken advantage of this opportunity. Perhaps its goal had only been to use Yeming to successfully escape the tower, or perhaps it truly did worship Yeming's looks. That Jiao stole a small portion of Yeming's dragon power to try and escape from its prison, but the Dragon King soon discovered this. The 7 Dragon Kings below the 9th layer combined their forces and dealt with that nameless Jiao on the spot. But at the very moment they killed it, the nameless Jiao's body burst open, releasing its bloodied offspring. That was Xia Yu, Yeming said calmly. Li Jinglong replied solemnly, so it is your son. I have never mentioned this to an outsider, Yeming said. Even to the dragon subduing saint, I have only referred to Xia Yu as my adopted child. Li Jinglong asked, what happened after that? How did it come to possess such strong hatred? Li Jinglong originally thought that this matter of Xia Yu was already settled, but now, he dimly began to realize that things weren't that simple. Its father was guilty, Yeming said. Both of its fathers were, but it was not. I overrode all other objections to let it remain on the 9th level. I raised it, and as for its past, none of the Dragon Kings said a single word. It did, however, possess intelligence. It was not like the rest of them, not like the rest of the Jiao in the tower. They were naturally ruthless and cruel. Xia Yu was more like a human, more like any youth out there in the world. It wanted to leave this tower to see the world it did not know, Yeming continued. When it was young and ignorant, it tried to run away from home, but its home was not a normal home, nor was its father only its father. Ashinakayan was frowning deeply, and he let out a deep sigh from where he was sitting on the railings. Li Jinglong was deep in thought as he stared off into the distance. This action enraged the Dragon Kings, Yeming said at last. To Xia Yu, this was nothing more than it running away from home out of disobedience, but to the Jiao and the dragons in the tower, it was an incomparably shocking matter. I had no choice but to throw it into the abyss on the 1st level. In the abyss, there is no light of the sun, no passage of time, no signs of life. There are only endless ruins, as well as darkness and loneliness. Time passes differently on the 1st level than in the rest of the tower. It moves extremely slowly, Yeming said gravely. As soon as you are thrown into the abyss, you will never be able to leave. You must grow old within it, and eventually die. When he heard that, Li Jinglong said, but in the end, you could not stop yourself from releasing it. To a child who had never wandered the world, who had never seen the mountains and the plains, the rivers and the streams, who had never learned of the flora and the fauna, who had been born in a prison and was destined to die in a prison, that was too cruel, Yeming replied. I imagine that, to it, I must be an evil father. The first crime that I committed was that I did not keep myself in check, and instead gave birth to it. Some children thank their parents for giving them life, Li Jinglong said slowly. Some children do not. Correct, Yeming said. The second error that I made, as well as my greatest, was to let it out. Li Jinglong fell silent. He suddenly thought of Hung Jun, as well as the gaze with which Yang Kuozhong looked at Hung Jun. For the sake of removing the seed of Mara from his body, Hung Jun's father had had him, and for the sake of relieving his loneliness, Xia Yu's father had had him. From a certain point of view, the way these two had come into existence seemed to bear striking resemblance to each other. After I let it out the second time, I asked it a question, Yeming said. I asked, do you hate me for giving you life? Xiaoyu replied, no. It felt that things were always better as long as it was alive. Ashinakayang said, you underestimated it too much. It was the most like a dragon, Yeming said. It was able to clearly understand the restlessness and pain of the Qiao, as well as our unease. When it was small, it would ask after everything that it did not understand, and it had many questions. Even after I imprisoned it in the abyss for almost 1,000 years, after it came out, it still acted as it had when it was young. It had not changed much. As soon as these words were spoken, Ashinakayang and Li Jinglong couldn't resist the cold shudders that traveled down their backs. You were tricked, Li Jinglong said. That is correct, Yeming replied. After being imprisoned for 1,000 years, the Xiaoyu that appeared in front of me must have been filled with hatred and pain, someone who spent every moment wanting to get its revenge. But at the time, I did not sense that. I simply thought that it had repented. Later, it killed me. It had absorbed too much hatred and suffering in the depths of the abyss. That was the resentment of all of the Jiao that had been exiled and imprisoned in the abyss, who then slowly died, tormented over the long years. In the words of the human realm, that was, a devil. End chapter.